My name is Josh Floyd,
My name is Christina Jimenez.
and we are both attorneys here at Jimenez Floyd Family Law Firm, and both board certified. And today we're going to talk to you about child support and some various issues that come up with child support.
Very good. So one of the biggest things that we have to discuss in the context of child support whenever a client hires us or they're consulting with us is how do we calculate child support? Okay, and so there's certain things that we're obviously going to look at. We're going to be looking at the income, right? And what type of income are you earning and what type of income can we consider? And then we kind of get into percentages. There's guideline principles, and then from there's potential deviations from those guidelines. And so, Floyd, in the context of income, what income can the court consider when calculating support?
Generally speaking, the court will consider all income, right? They lay out some exceptions, like any government benefits, so TANF or Social Security income, they don't consider as income for purposes of child support. If you have return of principal income, accounts receivable, and foster care income. They don't consider any of that when calculating support, but pretty much everything else is fair game. So per diem, bonuses, overtime, we get those questions a lot.
Right. And so, I will tell you that we always get asked, well, I only get this bonus, quarterly, and it's not guaranteed. Why are they going to factor that in? Or I'll say, here, well, this, I only get this per diem on certain days and it's not guaranteed and I'm not going to be getting it next month. I will hear things like, well, I have a rental property, but there's also, expenses that I might have to pay on this property next month. Why are they calculating that in? Why are they factoring it in? And the bottom line is because the code says that they can, number one. And number two, there's ways to deal with those things. So the Texas Family Code actually states that you should annualize income whenever possible, right? And so whenever we calculate support, we're going to, and the court's going to, take into consideration the fluctuations in your income, right? We're going to look at the entirety of the year, and so maybe if the summer is a great income time for you because you work in construction, but in the winter you hardly make any income. Those are things that the court will consider when annualizing your income, so that way it stays fair throughout the year, right?
Yeah, because I think it's important to point out that that's the way child support is calculated too, is based on annual, so you pay monthly, but it's based over the course of a year. So even though you have the child for the summer, right, you still pay child support the month you have summer because they've annualized what the other party needs to support the child for that year. Right.
And so we're always going to be looking at net income. And when in the context of you owning a business, right, we are going to look at your gross income minus your expenses, and then we're going to get down to net income, right? And so that's one of the things that in the context of when somebody owns a business and they retain us and we're calculating that support, we sometimes spend quite a bit of time looking at that, right? And sometimes we deal with small business owners where perhaps you don't have a bookkeeper and you're not keeping up with your books the way that you should. And so there have been times where we have to go, back a year and say, okay, let's get our books in order because we need to, you think that you're earning $100,000 each year and you haven't done your taxes in 2 or 3 years. And in actuality, you're only actually earning $30,000. And we don't want your support to be based on net income of $100,000 when you're not actually making that, right?
Correct. Yeah. So business owners make it very difficult for us to calculate child support. But when we're calculating child support, so you have the gross and then you get to a net. And basically, the way Texas has it, they have a chart that's in the family code that kind of sets out the net for you. But there's exceptions to that net. That's just kind of the presumption. And so if you have a basis to go in and argue, my net should be this instead of this because I have to take more, claim more people or whatever, or I have to pay state income tax, or I have mandatory retirement, something like that. But generally speaking, I guess let's go over calculating it first so that what we're saying makes sense.
Yeah, right? I was thinking you're jumping ahead. So first with guidelines, right? So when we talk about guidelines, what are the Texas, and I know we can't go through all of them, but there's child support guidelines for 1 kiddo, 2 kiddos, and then if you have more than one child that's outside of this particular case, there's certain percentages that we put on them.
Yeah, so that's a little tricky, but so just the general guidelines for you only have children subject to this suit, right? So if you have one child, it's 20%, 2 children, it's 25, 3 is 30, and up 5%, all the way to 40% with 5 kids, and then after that, it just kind of, the court determines it. And if you have, one child here and then one child with someone else, then it's like 18.5% or something, right? And so you could potentially end up paying, if you have one kid here and one kid there, right, you're paying 37% of your income in child support, whereas if you have two kids with the same mom, you're paying 25%. So that's kind of the standard guidelines on how that works. Do you want to go over low-income guidelines?
Sure. You go over it.
Okay, I'll go over that. First, I'll mention there's a cap of $80,550 that the courts will consider for child support. So anything above that is not considered for child support purposes. There's also a bottom, right? And so if you make less than $1,000 a month, then the percentage is lower, right? So instead of being 20% for one child, it's 15, and instead of 25 for two kids, it's 20. So it lowers 5% of the normal guidelines for the low-income guidelines for people that make less than $1,000 a month.
Yeah, and I mean, if you find yourself in a situation, I actually think that it's here on our website where we have the chart for the calculations, and if not, just Google it, right? Because if you start dealing with these situations with multiple children, like not in this case, the percentages get a little bit wonky, and that's far too complex for the purpose of this video, right? And so after we get to the guidelines, right? And so the guidelines are just that, right? That's what the courts are traditionally going to do. They're traditionally going to look at that, and I think it's the presumption, right? I know it's presumption that the courts are going to follow the guidelines. However, they can deviate from these guidelines, and there's certain factors that the courts can consider when they are going to deviate from the guidelines. And so things like needs of the child, things of child care, travel expenses to exercise visitation. What else, Floyd? There's lots of them.
The funds available, right? Things like private school, tutoring, like you said, the needs of the child, those are examples of that.
Yeah, but whenever you're arguing a deviation from the guidelines, right, we can argue a deviation to go up, we can argue a deviation to go down, right? It just depends on that particular situation. And I do think that that's something that a lot of attorneys miss, and they don't really factor when they're making these arguments. A lot of attorneys just say, okay, guidelines are the guidelines, this is what we're going to do. And really we should be looking at this and analyzing it to say, okay, is there any chance or hope that we can maybe increase the support for the custodial parent or decrease it for the person that's visiting because there's these other issues or factors that they're living with, right?
I agree, and I think that's it really on calculating.
Anything else so. Nope, I think that's good. And then the other thing is, or I guess the next issue is, what's the impact of custody arrangements on child support?
So the guidelines, the presumption that guidelines are in the best interest, there's a presumption for standard possession, right? The possession schedule that is also in the best interest. Those kind of go hand in hand. So when you modify the standard possession order and deviate from that presumption, it can also cause a deviation from the presumption that the guidelines are in the best interest. And so what we're seeing a lot now is like 50-50 possession schedules, right? And that being a cause for the court to deviate from the typical guidelines that are set out for child support. Typically when we see a 50-50, we're going to see them offset child support. So calculate child support for one parent, calculate it for the other parent, and then the parent that would have to pay more just kind of pays the difference. And the justification for that is, you don't want one parent, getting to feed the child T-bones and the other one feeding them ramen soup, right? And then, one parent getting to go on a bunch of vacation with the kids and the other parent can't afford to do it because one parent makes a lot more money. So that's one of the ways that you'll deviate there.
Very good. The other way that we see it, and other arguments that we've made, is if the parent, the primary conservator, right, the one who's designating the residence, let's say that they decide to relocate, and now we have the visiting parent who is having to pay to get their children, to visit them, right? We have gone through and we've done lots of calculations on, okay, here's flight expenses, hotel expenses, etc. And Judge, you need to factor that into this particular case. And even though perhaps father should be paying, $2,200 a month in child support, he's going to be paying $1,200 a month to go and visit his kiddos. So that needs to be subtracted from what his obligation would be.
Yep, and a lot of times the courts will do that. Reduce it for air flight and all that kind of stuff.
Air flight.
Yeah, air flight fare.
Very good. And so, I guess there's certain circumstances where we think that it's prudent to hire an experienced family law attorney, like the attorneys here at Jimenez Law Firm, board certified in family law,
And are really good with child support issues.
right. And so, if you're dealing with a situation where there is perhaps your mom and dad is the business owner, and we think maybe he isn't disclosing all assets, or excuse me, all income. We need to be able to dig into that information. We do have experts that we work with, CPAs, that will kind of help us, break all that information down. If you think that, perhaps he's hiding income or he's hiding revenue, maybe he has bank accounts that you don't know about, those types of situations, we really like to get involved, start doing some discovery, and then trying to find that income.
Yeah, so I think a mistake that a lot of lesser experienced attorneys make is relying on the tax returns, right? And say, okay, well, his tax return says that he netted X, right? But if you go in and you look at the deductions that they took, a lot of them are personal deductions, and obviously these small business owners write off everything they can to avoid tax consequences, right? And stuff that aren't typically business expenses, and so you've got to go through those and then add all that stuff he wasn't supposed to write off back in to his income. Otherwise, your client could be potentially adversely impacted.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've had cases where the husband, or the father rather, was claiming that he didn't own and operate a trucking company, and it was his wife's company. And in the tax returns, the LLC formation documents, everything was under wife's name, and so they had papered it up pretty well. But because we got involved, we were able to really deep dive into everything, and we went, years back in social media posts, and we find a social media post where the father is actually saying, I started this company for this reason, and I've been doing this for this many years. He was clearly the face of the company. And in that particular case, we were able to get the other attorney to settle because he understood that the optics of that entire situation was not going to go well. And I think maybe somebody who didn't have our experience may have just said, listen, there's nothing we can do about this because this is what the tax returns are showing and what the formation documents say, and that particular client would have been out of a lot of money. And so if you find yourself in one of those types of situations, you absolutely need to call either our firm or another attorney in your area that can kind of help you navigate those issues because they can get very complicated very quickly. So what else, Floyd? Anything else on
I guess
child
just
support?
dealing more with businesses also, like if you have a business entity, right, the income from the business isn't considered, right? And so what we see sometimes is people leaving that money in the business rather than taking distributions as their income. And so they may be paying themselves a couple $1,000s a month, but the business is profiting $10,000 a month, and then back to, they're paying mortgages and stuff out of that business income, but it's not actually being distributed to them. And so we can go back in and take all that money and add it to their income because it's a personal expense, just like we did with the tax returns.
Right.
So,
one thing that we didn't have on our list, but I do think that we need to talk about is enforcement of child support, right? Because this is, for the child support.
I agree.
Yep.
Yep.
And so a lot of times you will have parents or a father or mother that is court ordered to pay child support, and they don't make those payments. And so now we're left with a situation where we have to file a motion for enforcement to hold that parent in contempt of court. And so moving forward with an enforcement of child support in and of itself, I don't think is that difficult. I've seen attorneys screw that up, unfortunately, but it's not that difficult. But I think defending against an enforcement, if you don't have the right tools in your toolbox, that could create big problems for you, because there are things called affirmative defenses, and there's ways to be able to defend against a potential enforcement. And on the flip side of that, if you're the custodial parent and you're trying to enforce that child support, and that the other side is going to come forward with these affirmative defenses, you have to have an experienced attorney that can say, I understand that that's what they're saying, but let me show you why it's not true, right?
Yeah, and setting those affirmative defenses up correctly and pleading those correctly. If you don't do that, you're going to waive them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you don't have an experienced attorney to take care of that for you, you could potentially be putting yourself in a very, very bad position, looking at jail time just
Right.
because something was not done correctly.
Right. And having the ability and the knowledge and the resources to be able to go in and do the investigation to prove that the affirmative defenses are not true. So we had a father who hadn't paid support in probably 2 years or so, and the attorney his attorney pled the affirmative defenses. They claimed he didn't have income, he didn't have money, he didn't have things that he could sell in order to pay his support. He didn't have anybody that he could borrow from to be able to pay the support. And we start digging, and we figured out that during one of the months that he didn't pay child support, he had actually purchased a boat. And so their affirmative defenses completely went out the window, and he ended up having to sit a few days in jail because he didn't make the support. And he ended up paying, I think, $16,000 within a couple of weeks because he wanted to get out of jail early. So things that we can do from that perspective.
And with an enforcement, because this is also an issue a lot whenever you have the custodial parent, the non-custodial is not paying, right? It's not fair for the custodial parent to have to hire an attorney and pay all this money because this guy's not paying, right? And so with an enforcement, you're entitled to get those attorney's fees back, right? Anything that's spent on the enforcement, a lot of times enforcements get convoluted with modifications, and so on modifications you don't get the money, but the enforcement portion, the courts will order the other party to pay your attorney's fees for you having to bring that suit.
Right. And since you mentioned modifications, let's just go with it. Let's roll with it. Also not on our list, but we're going to.
It's on my list.
I don't know, why didn't you bring it up? So when we're talking about modifications, it's important to remember that child support can be modified, right? And so there's certain criteria that needs to occur in order for the modification to occur. So the first is a material and substantial change in circumstances, and the second is 3 years have passed from the prior order or mediated settlement agreement, and there would be a change in child support in either $100 or 20%, right? And so keep that in mind, because sometimes I see attorneys who are filing modifications too soon. Other times I am seeing attorneys or clients that come to us and say, well, I thought I'm stuck with this child support. And I'm like, no, he's making more money. Let's go back in and let's get you some more support. Right?
Yeah, and there's some exceptions to that. If something is poorly drafted, you didn't have the right attorney the first time, right, to where you may not be able to come in and modify because your ability that has been waived by some agreements that you entered into.
Right.
And so that's where, dealing with child support, it's beneficial to have an experienced attorney that handle that for you, because we know those little pitfalls, right, that we will advise you that if you agree to this is the impact it's going to have on your future ability to modify, right? And if you don't know that, you could be potentially waiving that without dealing with it. And one thing we've seen a lot, I don't say a lot, but it's unfortunate, is when people trade property for child support, right? Like the other party will agree, I'm not going to require you to pay child support if you give me this house, right? 3 years later, they come back and they hit you with child support. And the judge is like, I don't care if you gave the house.
Right. Right.
So.
Yeah, so there's things that you have to consider. And I mean, I think a lot of attorneys try to look at child support very black and white, right? Like, this is what the code says, these are the guidelines, this is what's going to happen. And in all actuality, it's just really not that simple. And there's always going to be things that we can, factor in, things that we can argue in order to make sure that for your particular situation, the child support is calculated correctly. And so if you need any assistance with any sort of child support related issues, we're Jimenez Floyd. I'm Jimenez, he's Floyd, and we're here to help you guys. As previously stated, we have offices in Denton, Dallas, Flower Mound, Louisville, Odessa, and Midland.